Do you love Planeswalkers and want to play a commander that takes full advantage of their abilities? Is your idea of fun setting up strong value engines that grind your opponents into submission or concession? Have you wanted to play a control deck that is highly interactive with permanents, doesn't rely on the stack, and finishes the game with devastating effects that truly represent the control archetype? Then I think it's time that Aminatou and her friends show us what Planeswalkers in Commander can really do. So before we begin, let's have a look at Aminatou and see how we can get the most out of her abilities. Aminatou the Fateshifter is a 3-mana Planeswalker that has 3 abilities. The first is a +1 that says, draw a card, then put a card from your hand on top of your library. The -1 says, exile another target permanent you own, then return it to the battlefield under your control. The -6 ability says, choose left or right, each player gains control of all non-land permanents other than Aminatou the Fateshifter, controlled by the next player in the chosen direction. So right off the bat, I think we can discount the -6 ability, as we can't really make use of it in all but the most niche of cases. The draw ability, however, where we can fix the top of our library, is something that we can take advantage of, so we want to keep an eye out for cards that care about being on the top of our library. It's the -1 ability, however, that I think is most useful and something we want to build around. But it does raise an important question. With commanders like Brago King Eternal and Yorion Sky Nomad, why wouldn't we play them instead, especially considering they can blink multiple Planeswalkers all at once? Well, firstly, and perhaps most importantly, is their card type. Aminatou is a Planeswalker, unlike Brago and Yorion, which are creatures. Now in Commander, Planeswalkers can be hard to protect with all of the creatures our opponents can potentially have on board. Therefore, creature board wipes become a necessity, and Aminatou, by nature of her card type, doesn't get affected by these at all. In addition, Aminatou can blink any permanent, not just non-land permanents, so there's very likely to be cards and interactions that are quite powerful that we can abuse with this fact. Combine this with the fact that Esper colors are renowned for playing a strong control game, especially towards creatures, and it isn't hard to see why Aminatou is suited for a Planeswalker strategy. So let's move on to one of the most important questions you always have to ask yourself when building a deck: just how does it win? Let's look at the cards that answer that question. First up is Deepglow Skate, a 5-mana creature that says, when Deepglow Skate enters the battlefield, double the number of each kind of counter on any number of target permanents. So for many of our Planeswalkers, reaching and activating their ultimates can be game-ending for our opponents, but this is usually kept in check by making getting to those ultimates a time-intensive process. With Deepglow Skate, this can allow many of our Planeswalkers to ultimate right away. Not only this, but blinking it with Aminatou usually means those Planeswalkers can survive ultimating, giving us a chance to get another emblem again and again. If Deepglow Skate is allowed to hit the battlefield even once with a few walkers on board, the game will drastically swing in our favour, if not end it completely. Next up is Resourceful Defense, a 3-mana enchantment that says, whenever a permanent you control leaves the battlefield, if it had counters on it, put those counters on target permanent you control. You can also pay 5 mana as often as you like to move any number of counters from target permanent you control to another target permanent you control. This card is where Aminatou really shines in a Planeswalker strategy. If we have Aminatou and 2 walkers out, we blink one of them using Aminatou. When that walker leaves the battlefield, we can put all the counters it had on another Planeswalker, and depending on how many moved over, this could be enough to ultimate that walker. So this essentially serves a similar role to Deepglow Skate, allowing us to ultimate our Planeswalkers much faster, but it does so largely through our commander. But in a pinch when we have the mana available, we can also just activate Resourceful Defense's ability to transfer the counters when Aminatou cannot. Like Deepglow Skate, if this card resolves, your opponents won't have long to react before the game slips away from them. Abdel Adrian, Gorion's Ward, is a 5-mana creature that says, when Abdel Adrian, Gorion's Ward enters the battlefield, exile any number of other non-land permanents you control until Abdel Adrian leaves the battlefield. Create a 1/1 white soldier creature token for each permanent exiled this way. So Abdel serves as an alternative win con that doesn't involve ultimating our Planeswalkers, creating a larger and larger army every time we blink him, while also providing bodies to protect our walkers too. In addition, Abdel does provide a mass blink effect for our non-land permanents, meaning we can reuse permanents like artifacts for mana and walkers for their abilities. The sheer amount of versatility Abdel provides at 5 mana should serve us well. Our last win con, which also doesn't involve ultimating our Planeswalkers, is Agent of Treachery. This is a 7-mana creature that says, when Agent of Treachery enters the battlefield, gain control of target permanent. Also, at the beginning of your end step, if you control 3 or more permanents you don't own, draw 3 cards. This is a powerful finisher in any blink deck, and ours is no different. We have a number of cards including Aminatou that can blink agent, so it won't take long for this to take over a game, especially considering it starts to draw us a significant amount of cards once we have stolen 3 permanents, something we shouldn't struggle to reach with Aminatou in the command zone. And that covers our main win cons. Although they do represent the fastest routes to victory, it's important to remember that reaching our Planeswalker ultimates the fair way by upticking them each turn is also a viable win con, especially considering how much interaction the deck runs. Speaking of interaction, let's look at the cards that are going to protect our Planeswalkers to help them reach their game end in ultimates. Let's begin by looking at the cards that will help to keep the board clear for our Planeswalkers. First up is Austere Command, a 6-mana sorcery that can help us wipe the board of creatures, but in a pinch also gives us the option of destroying artifacts and enchantments too. Notably, none of these options affect our Planeswalkers, so they will always be safe after resolving this. Cyclonic Rift is a 2-mana sorcery that bounces a non-land permanent we don't control to its owner's hand, but can be overloaded for 7 mana to bounce all of them. Simply one of the best board wipes for the cost, it buys us time to activate our walkers further and get closer to those ultimates. Dam is a 2-mana sorcery that can destroy a single creature or wipe the board if we pay 4 mana into it. Most of the time we will cast it for its overload cost, but sometimes if we have a powerful creature like Deepglow Skate or Agent of Treachery on board, the option to remove a single creature is nice to have and enhances the power of this card. Doomscar is a 5-mana sorcery that destroys all creatures, but we can actually cast it for 3 mana if we foretell it first. This card curves nicely with Aminatou, foretelling this on turn 2, casting our commander turn 3, and wiping the board turn 4 or 5 depending on what our opponents get down. Foretelling this will also put your opponents on alert that a board wipe is available and may make them hesitant to cast their creatures without protection up first, making this a great tempo play. Farewell is a 6-mana sorcery that mana for mana is one of the best board wipes in Commander. It says choose one or more. Exile all artifacts, exile all creatures, exile all enchantments, and exile all graveyards. This ability to mass exile permanents of our choice, especially the graveyard, can be a serious blow to several different deck archetypes. And similar to Austere Command, it also doesn't hit our Planeswalkers, making this another powerful board wipe that leaves them untouched. Because we run little graveyard recursion, nor do we rely on our graveyard, don't be afraid to exile the yards with this, as it will likely hurt our opponents much more. Out of Time is a 3-mana enchantment that says, when Out of Time enters the battlefield, untap all creatures, then phase them out until Out of Time leaves the battlefield. Put a time counter on Out of Time for each creature phased out this way. It also has Vanish in, which means that at the beginning of your upkeep, remove a time counter from this enchantment. When the last is removed, sacrifice it. So with Aminatou, we can continue to flicker this every time our opponents put more and more creatures on the battlefield, meaning as long as Aminatou is out, our opponents won't be able to keep creatures on board. Phasing also means we can get rid of commanders and our opponents have no way of getting them back until they remove Out of Time. The sheer level of power for the cost makes this the best board wipe in the deck for creatures, and it is a card that will single-handedly make your opponents fear to play this deck because of it. Supreme Verdict is a 4-mana sorcery that destroys all creatures and can't be countered. A perfect card to resolve against decks that interact heavily on the stack, making sure we stay in the front seat of the control game and keep the tempo firmly in our favour. Terminus is a 6-mana sorcery that puts all creatures on the bottom of their owner's libraries, but can be cast for 1 mana if it was the first card drawn that turn. So this is a card that we can take full advantage of using Aminatou's +1 ability, cheaply wiping the board when we need to. It's also important to note this board wipe gets around indestructibility, which can come in handy against certain decks. For example, those running the indestructible Theros gods as their commanders. Toxic Deluge is a 3-mana sorcery that we can pay life into to give all creatures -X/-X, where X is the life we paid into it. Cheap and efficient creature removal that also gets around indestructibility, it easily earns a place in the deck. Our last board wipe is Vanquish the Horde, an 8-mana sorcery that destroys all creatures, but has its cost reduced by 1 for each creature on the board. This means that with 6 creatures on board, not a hard situation to encounter, even early game, we can cast this for 2 mana. This is a great board wipe that scales very well with the game and what our deck is trying to do. Now let's move on to other ways the deck interacts. Act of Authority is a 3-mana enchantment that exiles an artifact or enchantment upon ETB. With Aminatou, we can flicker this as we need to remove any problematic artifacts or enchantments, and this will make our opponents hesitant to resolve them while this is still on board. Dakon Shadowslayer is a 3-mana planeswalker that ETBs with a number of counters on it equal to the number of lands we control, and we can exile a creature with its -3 ability. This can help keep the board clear of powerful creatures, especially as the game goes longer, and Aminatou flicker in it means it enters with more and more counters to be used. Its +1 ability to Surveil 2 also gives us some card selection by filtering the top of our library. The -6 ultimate won't be used nor useful that often, though it's always a nice option to have for the 3 artifacts we run that cost 4 mana or more. Gilded Drake is a 2 mana creature that lets us gain control of a creature an opponent controls. For 2 mana, this is very powerful for the cost, but with Aminatou we can flicker Gilded Drake and steal things again and again. This is because Aminatou says to exile a permanent you own, not control, so this card essentially becomes a 2 mana repeatable steal effect, something your opponents will struggle to play through if they don't get rid of it quickly. Jace, Unraveller of Secrets, is a 5 mana planeswalker that we can -2 to return a creature to its owner's hand. It also has some small draw and card filtering available as well for its +1, letting us scry one and draw a card. But if we get to its ultimate, an emblem that says, whenever an opponent casts their first spell each turn, counter that spell, although not game ending, it will start to significantly deny your opponents of resources, especially considering all the interaction we already run. Liliana Dreadhorde General, however, is a 6 mana planeswalker that can end the game with her ultimate, which says, each opponent chooses a permanent they control of each permanent type and sacrifices the rest. With so few resources after this resolves, it will be very likely your opponents will concede in response. But until Liliana reaches her ultimate, her -4 allows us to clear the board of some creatures by making each player sacrifice 2, and her +1 makes a 2/2 zombie. Her passive ability of drawing a card whenever a creature we control dies also makes the zombie she creates that much more useful, serving as protection for our walkers and card advantage. Gnarset, Parter of Veils, keeps our opponent's card draw in check by only allowing them to draw 1 card per turn. In addition, she also provides us card advantage with her -2 ability. Cast early or late, Gnarset provides a lot of value for the cost and plays into our control plan very well. Obnixilis Reignited is a 5 mana planeswalker that allows us to destroy a creature with its -3 ability, but it also provides card advantage too with its +1 which draws us a card at the loss of 1 life. You can see a similar recurring theme where many of our planeswalkers can serve multiple purposes depending on our needs at the time. Aminatou being able to blink them means we aren't just restricted to one choice either, enhancing our ability to control the board. If one player is a particular problem for us, Obnixilis' ultimate shouldn't take long to take care of them, where the emblem they get says, whenever a player draws a card, you lose 2 life. Keep in mind this is any player, not just the player we give the emblem to, so this life loss will very quickly add up, especially considering how fundamental card advantage is to advancing many decks' game plans. Teferi, Hero of Dominaria, is a 5 mana planeswalker whose -3 ability can put a target non-land permanent into its owner's library 3rd from the top, actually making this a powerful form of bounce removal. His +1 draws us a card and untaps 2 lands at end step, providing card advantage as well. If we reach his ultimate, an emblem which says, whenever you draw a card, exile target permanent an opponent controls, we won't have any trouble at all keeping our opponents locked down, especially with multiple walkers out that can draw cards also. Teferi, Master of Time, is a 4 mana planeswalker that actually allows us to activate his abilities once per turn on each player's turn. His -3 ability allows us to phase out a creature, very useful against commander-centric decks, and his +1 allows us to draw and discard, filtering through to the cards we need. Because we can activate him every turn, it won't take long for us to get to his ultimate, which will give us 2 extra turns. This won't necessarily guarantee us the game, but it should set us up to be in a strong position to do so. Teferi Time Raveler is a 3 mana planeswalker that prevents our opponents from casting spells or interacting at instant speed. He can also return 1 artifact, enchantment, or creature to its owner's hand, and if that wasn't enough, it draws us a card for doing so. His +1 also allows us to cast sorcery spells at instant speed, meaning we can have a board wipe in hand and cast it on any player's turn, useful against creature combo decks or creature decks that heavily rely on haste. At this mana value, Teferi Time Raveler provides a lot of utility and power for the deck. Last but not least, Ugin the Ineffable is a 6 mana planeswalker whose -3 ability can destroy a permanent that's 1 or more colours. Being able to hit permanents is very useful because most of our removal only hits creatures, which can be problematic against certain decks. His +1 also makes token blockers for our walkers, which provide card advantage, even if the tokens get exiled or bounced. In addition, he has a passive ability to reduce the cost of all our colourless spells by 2 generic mana. This is actually pretty relevant for this deck, as almost all of our mana acceleration is in the form of artifacts. And that covers our interactive package. Hopefully it gives you some reassurance that our walkers will be protected, especially considering some of them protect themselves. Now let's move on to the cards that are going to help draw us cards and help keep Aminatou's friends hitting the board. Coveted Jewel is a 6 mana artifact that taps for 3 mana of any colour and draws 3 cards when it ETBs. However, if 1 or more creatures an opponent controls attacks us and aren't blocked, that player draws 3 cards and gains control of Coveted Jewel. They also get to untap it. Although costly at 6 mana, it immediately refunds as 3 mana, and with Aminatou we can blink it to draw 3 cards and gain another 3 mana, which essentially pays for itself. Now, a common concern with this card is one of our opponents immediately gaining control of it during the same turn cycle, which is a valid concern. However, between all the board wipes we run and the removal attached to our walkers, it isn't hard to keep control of this artifact turn after turn. In fact, it's quite reasonable for us to play this, blink it with Aminatou, and draw a board wipe to cast immediately. Once you play this a few times, you'll understand why it's in the deck and how good it actually ends up being. Dovin Band is a 4 mana planeswalker whose -1 ability can gain us a life and draw a card. Its +1 also acts as interaction, giving one target creature -3, -0, and not allowing its activating abilities to be activated until our next turn. Dovin's ultimate can also be quite devastating for our opponents, not allowing them to untap more than 2 permanents during their untap steps. Jace the Mind Sculptor is a 4 mana planeswalker who provides card advantage and interaction. His 0 ability gives us a brainstorm effect, and his +2 allows us to control what one of our opponents draws next, very useful when the game comes down to a 1v1. The -1 ability allows us to return a creature to its owner's hand, which will sometimes be used on our own creatures like Deepglow Skate and Gilded Drake to trigger their ETBs again. Jace's ultimate will rarely matter, because when we have cards down that allow us to get there, we'd prefer to do so with most of our other walkers instead. Kato Shizuki is a 3 mana planeswalker whose +1 can loot, or we can draw a card if we attacked with a creature that turn. His -1 creates an unblockable 1/1 ninja, useful to trigger his first ability. And he also protects himself by phasing himself out if he entered the battlefield that turn, meaning we can activate his abilities and then phase him out using Aminatou, making him much easier to keep around and benefit from. If we reach his ultimate, he gives us an emblem with, whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, search your library for a blue or black creature card, put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle. In our deck, Agent of Treachery and Deepglow Skate will often be the targets. Kaya, Ghost Assassin, is a 4 mana planeswalker whose -2 ability draws us a card and makes each opponent discard a card, meaning this doubles up as card draw and interaction. Her -1 causes each opponent to lose 2 life and us to gain 2, something we will rarely use unless an opponent's life is already low enough. The 0 ability, which says, exile Kaya Ghost Assassin or up to 1 target creature, return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of your next upkeep, you lose 2 life, may not seem that useful on first appearances, but it actually works incredibly well with Resourceful Defense. When Kaya blinks herself with Resourceful Defense out, she will transfer her 5 counters to another planeswalker. For many of them, this is enough to ultimate them straight away, making Kaya and Defense a powerful card combination that wins us the game faster. Mystic Remora and Rhystic Study are tax and card draw effects that always have a home in a control shell, and ours is no different. But Mystic Remora is notably much better with Aminatou, as she can blink it so we only ever have to pay 1 for its upkeep cost. This means we can keep it around turn after turn, which will no doubt be a major thorn in our opponent's sides. Gnarset Transcendent is a 4 mana planeswalker whose +1 ability lets us look at the top card of our library. If it's a non-creature non-land card, we may reveal it and put it into our hand. Not the most powerful nor reliable card draw, I'll admit, but Gnarset's other abilities justify her inclusion. With her -2 ability, she gives our next instant or sorcery rebound, meaning if we cast a board wipe, we get to clear the board 2 turn cycles in a row, helping to keep our walkers alive. But if we get to her ultimate, where our opponents can't cast non-creature spells, it can be game ending for many decks, because from there we can very easily answer creature board states. Teferi, who slows the sunset, is a 4 mana planeswalker whose -2 ability lets us look at the top 3 cards of our library, putting one of them into our hand and the rest on the bottom of our library in any order, therefore giving us card draw and filtering. His +1 ability, where we choose up to 1 target artifact, creature, and land, and untap the chosen permanents we control, then tap the chosen permanents we don't control, can also act as mana acceleration and mild interaction also. Now we would include this card just based on those abilities, but Teferi's ultimate is also useful to us. It gives us an emblem with, untap all permanents you control during each opponent's untap step, and you draw a card during each opponent's draw step. Now the untap step won't matter much for our deck, but drawing a card each player's turn will. Teferi provides a lot of versatility for the deck and will always be a welcome walker to hit the battlefield. Last up is Will Kenrith, a 6 mana planeswalker whose -2 ability lets us draw 2 cards and reduces the cost of our instant sorceries and planeswalker spells until our next turn, effectively making this card and mana advantage all in one ability. He also provides interaction in his +2 ability, where until our next turn, up to 2 target creatures each have base power and toughness 0/3 and lose all abilities. Effects like these are very handy when trying to avoid our planeswalkers getting hit, and losing all abilities is particularly useful against powerful creatures and commanders. Will's ultimate is strong, basically ensuring our board wipes resolve, though it won't help quickly end the game like many other ultimates. And that covers our card advantage package. As you probably recognise now from seeing most of our walkers, many of them fulfill double duty, acting as card advantage, mana acceleration, or interaction. This provides the deck with a lot of options in how it plays and how it interacts with the board. Now, if we can keep our opponent's creatures at bay, the only thing that will limit us is how many planeswalkers we can get on the battlefield. So let's look at the cards that are going to help accelerate our mana and planeswalker board state. Arcane Signet, Azorius Signet, Dimir Signet, Felwar Stone, Orzhov Signet, Talisman of Dominance, Talisman of Hierarchy, and Talisman of Progress are all 2-mana rocks that produce colour, important for helping to cast Aminatou as well as most of our walkers, which are typically 3 to 4 mana to cast. Bucknard's Everfull Purse is a 2-mana artifact that we can pay 1 into, then roll a d4 and create a number of treasure tokens equal to the result. The player to your right gains control of Bucknard's Everfull Purse. Now usually when players read this card, they read the second sentence and immediately pass on it. But remember, with Aminatou we can activate the purse, pass it to the player on the right, and then blink it with Aminatou, getting it right back. If we play this on turn 2, Aminatou on turn 3, and then activate and flicker with Aminatou on turn 4, we can potentially generate a lot of mana. The fact it also makes treasures also helps with some of our more pip-intensive cards. Thran Dynamo is a 4-mana artifact that can produce 3 colourless, which helps when we have a generally higher mana curve than the average deck. Gilded Lotus is another expensive rock, but this time it produces 3 mana of any one colour, a welcome effect in any 3-colour deck. It's also important to note that Thran Dynamo and Gilded Lotus can be blinked with Aminatou to turn these rocks into a pseudo ritual effect. Smothering Tithe is a 4-mana enchantment that taxes our opponents and generates treasures whenever our opponents draw cards. This deck is quite mana hungry, and Smothering Tithe is one of the best coloured mana generators in Esper. Peregrine Drake is a 5-mana creature that untaps 5 lands when it ETBs. With Aminatou on board, this acts as a ritual effect, essentially producing 5 mana every time we blink it. Our last mana accelerant is Teferi Temporal Archmage, a 6-mana planeswalker whose -1 ability can untap up to 4 target permanents. Because we will mostly target lands with this, in essence this reads as, produce 4 mana of any colour you need, which is quite a powerful ability. This is even more so if we have a Thran Dynamo, Gilded Lotus, or Coveted Jewel on board. Teferi also provides card advantage with his +1 ability, where we get to look at the top 2 cards of our library, then put one of them into our hand and the other on the bottom of our library. If we get his ultimate, where we may activate loyalty abilities of planeswalkers we control on any player's turn anytime we could cast an instant, all our planeswalkers will become supercharged and our opponents will have a hard time breaking through them. And that covers our mana accelerants. Now let's move on to our utility cards, cards that are going to enhance our planeswalkers or move us closer to victory. First up is Animate Dead, Dance of the Dead, and Necromancy. These are all enchantments that allow us to reanimate any creature from any player's graveyard. Because of the amount of creature board wipes we run, it won't take long for graveyards to become full. Sometimes a high value creature will hit someone's yard and this gives us a cheap way to access them. But if the creature has an ETB, we can actually blink these enchantments with Aminatou and we just retarget the same creature, returning it to the battlefield and providing us with value. This is actually a powerful trick we can pull with our own Agent of Treachery if it's in our graveyard. Displacer Kitten is a 4-mana creature that provides an incredible amount of value in this deck, blinking a non-land permanent every time we cast a non-creature spell. As of recording, this deck has 56 non-creature spells, so when we resolve Kitten, we are almost guaranteed to trigger it. Therefore, nearly every spell we cast will be able to flicker a planeswalker, allowing us to reuse their abilities again and again. We can also flicker mana rocks if we need more mana, and it works incredibly well with all of our previously discussed win cons. If Displacer Kitten manages to stick, your opponents will be in serious trouble. Felidar Guardian is a 4-mana creature that blinks any permanent we control when it ETBs. Often we will use this with Aminatou, resetting her counters, but other times we may bounce any other permanents we would normally target with Aminatou, like a mana rock or planeswalker. Luxior, Gyada's Gift, is a 1-mana artifact that we can equip to our planeswalkers to turn them into creatures. Not only will this protect a key walker from being attacked by our opponent's creatures, but it also makes our high loyalty counter walkers a viable blocker and attacker. Now Luxior can be a non-bow with the amount of board wipes we run in the deck, which is why it's important to equip this strategically, depending on where the board state is at. Also keep in mind when we want to unequip Luxior from a walker, we can just blink it with Aminatou, so even when we want to cast a board wipe, we have the option to do so quite easily. Oath of Teferi is a 5-mana enchantment that says, when Oath of Teferi enters the battlefield, exile another target permanent you control. Return it to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. Also, you may activate the loyalty ability of planeswalkers you control twice each turn rather than only once. So this card serves double duty, not only being able to blink any permanent we control, but also allowing our walkers to provide us with even more advantage from their abilities. With a board of even a few walkers, this enchantment can quickly become dangerous for our opponents. Primeval's Glorious Rebirth is a 7-mana sorcery that returns all legendary permanents from our graveyard to the battlefield, provided we control a legendary creature or planeswalker. Our opponents will be trying to kill our walkers every chance they get, so this gives us a great answer when the game goes long and we need to get them back into the fray. It's also important to note this won't just return our walkers, but also other legendary permanents too, like Luxior or Oath of Teferi. Scroll of Fate is a 3-mana artifact that we can tap to manifest a card from our hand, which is basically putting a card from our hand onto the battlefield face down as a creature. With Aminatou, we can blink the manifested card and it returns to the battlefield face up. So, this card essentially lets us cheat the mana value of our cards or sneak in a powerful permanent like a planeswalker that we need to hit at the right moment. We can even use this to put lands into play. The versatility and power of this card is actually quite high and it should enable some strong turns for the deck. Savin's Reclamation is a 3-mana sorcery that returns a permanent with mana value 3 or less to the battlefield. If we flash it back for 5 mana, we can return 2 permanents. This is largely here to return key cards like Resourceful Defense, but it can also be used to return other powerful cards like Mystic Remora for card draw and Necromancy for reanimation. When you have this card in your hand or graveyard, it should offer you a lot of options, especially when the game goes long. Spark Double is a 4-mana creature that can enter the battlefield as a copy of a creature or planeswalker we control. Having 2 of powerful walkers like Teferi Temporal Archmage or Liliana Dreadhorde General should put our opponents in a difficult situation, but often we will just have it copy Aminatou to ensure we can use her blink ability turn after turn. Key creatures this can also copy, like Deep Glow Skate and Abdel Adrian, can be game-ending in and of themselves. Spirit Sister's Call is a 5-mana enchantment that says, at the beginning of your end step, choose target permanent card in your graveyard. You may sacrifice a permanent that shares a card type with the chosen card. If you do, return the chosen card from your graveyard to the battlefield and it gains. If this permanent would leave the battlefield, exile it instead of putting it anywhere else. So this card acts as an expensive but repetitive recursion tool, allowing us to exchange permanents so we can return powerful effects to the battlefield. Imagine making a 1/1 ninja token with Kaito and then at the end step exchanging it for Agent of Treachery in our graveyard, or swapping your Act of Authority for a Smothering Tithe. This is quite a powerful effect, and with Aminatou we can then blink the return permanent so that it no longer has the exile clause on it anymore. This enchantment is something I'm sure you will have a lot of fun with. Temporal Mastery is a 7-mana sorcery that gives us an extra turn and is something that we can take advantage of using Aminatou's +1 ability. If it's the first card we draw for a turn, then it only costs us 2 mana instead, so regardless of how it comes to our hand, we can just activate Aminatou to make sure next turn we get a free turn at a very low cost. Sometimes just one more turn is all it takes to turn the tides in our favour. Our last utility card is Vensa the Sojourner, a 5-mana planeswalker whose +2 ability allows us to blink any permanent, though it returns to the battlefield at the next end step. We will mostly use this targeting Aminatou, though depending on what's on our board, he may have juicier targets like Agent of Treachery, Gilded Drake, or Out of Time. His -1 ability will rarely be useful, only really mattering if we're going for an Abdel Wincon using an army of soldiers. But his ultimate, an emblem with, whenever you cast a spell, exile target permanent, will quickly take care of any problems our opponents present to us. And that's all of our utility cards. Now let's move on to any notable lands the deck runs and how they contribute to our game plan. First up is Bojuka Bog, a land that can exile all cards from a target player's graveyard when it ETBs. So many decks utilize the graveyard in one way or another, and some rely on it heavily. Having a strong answer attached to a land is most welcome, but with Aminatou and her ability to blink any permanent, we can repeat this effect as we need it. Eiganjo, Seed of the Empire, helps us to take out any attackers trying to remove one of our walkers. Interplanar Beacon gives us a life every time we cast a planeswalker, but more importantly, it lets us filter mana into the colours we need so we can cast them much more easily. Khan's Bastion is a colourless land that also allows us to proliferate our walkers at the cost of 4 mana. While expensive for the cost, sometimes gaining one more loyalty counter is all we need to ultimate a walker in the late game, so having the option when we need it is nice. Otawara, Soaring City can help us protect our walkers from a key attacker, including bouncing the walker itself, and it also gives us a response to enchantments and artifacts that the deck has less answers for. Seagate Restoration, although expensive to cast at 7 mana, can help dig through our deck to find our win cons or any answers to problems that have hit the board. Finally, Takenuma Abandoned Mire can get us back a key walker or creature that our opponents had previously removed. And that sums up our important lands. Now let's move on to any spicy synergies or powerful plays the deck can produce that give you a real reason for wanting to play the deck. We have discussed many of the interesting intricacies the cards in this deck can have, many due to Aminatou herself, but one bears emphasizing, and that is the powerhouse that is Displacer Kitten. As mentioned previously, nearly every spell we cast will trigger Kitten, so let's look at some fun scenarios. Want every spell you cast to steal a permanent? You can with Agent of Treachery. Want every spell to draw 3 cards and generate 3 mana? Coveted Jewel will make it so. Want just a few spells to make it possible to get multiple emblems and ultimates from your Planeswalkers? Deep Glow Skate is the fish of your dreams. Even just targeting our Planeswalkers means drawing multiple cards, making lots of mana, or interacting several times with our opponents. Every time I have played this deck, my first thought has always went to, I hope I draw Kitten sometime this game. There are too many awesome interactions with this card to list. The only thing that is certain is that you will have a good time doing so. And that's the deck. Aminatou allows you to play a strong and effective Planeswalker strategy inside of a control and ETB shell. In addition, being able to bounce any permanent, not just non-land permanents, opens up interesting cards and lines of play and keeps the deck a joy to pilot. If you are someone who loves playing control magic and have been looking to dip your toes into a Planeswalker strategy, this is the deck for you. Esper packs some of the most control-themed emblems and ultimates in the game, and it will be incredibly satisfying every time you achieve them. Well, that's it from me today. I hope you enjoyed this look into Aminatou and her friends, and if you'd like to see how the deck performs in action, then make sure to stop by the channel where we will have gameplay videos up so you can see how it performs. But until then, take care guys.